OpenAI is sitting there at the mercy of Nvidia at the moment, right? If Jensen decides tomorrow that he doesn't like, OpenAI or Sam Altman, he can make their life extremely difficult. You've got to think that a large part of Sam Altman's job at the moment is trying to work out how they can make their own hardware and make their own GPUs.
Hi, Sam. So there's a lot going on, right? We just got back from Las Vegas, where we had Google's Cloud Next event and saw some very impressive announcements. And now OpenAI has dropped a new series of models, 4.1, that drives down the cost of the models and keeps OpenAI on the frontier in terms of the coding models, where it looked like Google and maybe Sonnet 3.7 from Anthropic had gotten ahead. Let's talk about the AI ecosystem wars, right, between OpenAI and Google and why this is great for the enterprise.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing a real sort of pivot over perhaps the past month, but definitely the Cloud Next sort of highlighted this, right? That things are no longer just about having a model or even a family of models, right? It's about having the agentic framework that goes with that. It's about having the deployment, stuff like that goes with that. There's a whole bunch of different things that are sort of making up these sort of agentic ecosystems, AI ecosystems, whatever you want to call it. I think, there's no clear name yet. But definitely what was clear at Next was that startups are getting left behind, right? A lot of the startups that haven't raised a lot of money and perhaps either relying on other people's models and that kind of thing, they don't know what's coming down the pipeline. They don't know how to sort of set up for, the different kinds of agentic things that are coming and stuff like that. I think today's OpenAI announcement just sort of caps this off, right? OpenAI is basically saying, hey, it's okay. We know that Claude has gotten a lot better. We know that Gemini's gotten a lot better. Okay, here's your new GPT 4.1, which has also gotten a lot better and a lot cheaper, right? That's the key thing.
So, Sam, let's break this into 3 points, right? The first point is the models now, despite the horse racing and 4.1 dropping and having like superior or the cheapest price for the Nano 4.1, for example, there's always some sort of trade-off, right? You're not going to get quite as good of a performance, and Google's probably next month going to come up with something that's maybe less expensive. So, today's announcement by OpenAI doesn't really change this model race, right? So the idea here is that, as you said, models are roughly at parity. They're going to potentially stay there. This isn't what the companies are going to be differentiating themselves off of each other around, right? So pricing, Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, talked about this frontier around performance per price is decreasing 4x every year, right? Pushing that frontier. So this is just going to happen, right? Coding capabilities, okay, roughly on par, right? I mean, context windows from Google are large. Now OpenAI's got a large million context window, right? Tool usage, right? Pretty much parity, right? Would you agree that the models, there's just very little differentiation?
I think this is definitely a catch-up step by OpenAI. So there are a few things that I think are really interesting here about the new models. Okay, one, clearly they've felt the pressure from Claude 3.5, 3.7 for coding, that people just stopped using OpenAI for coding, right? And then recently they started using the Gemini 2.5. Now this basically means people will go back to OpenAI for doing coding things. I think that's a huge thing for them because we know from Anthropic that's where Anthropic's making their money, right? Is from that kind of thing. The other interesting thing is the whole introduction of the nano model. So, like you pointed out, Gemini has like Gemini Pro, Gemini Flash, and Gemini Flash Lite. Now, in the previous generation of models, that was actually called Gemini Flash 8B, right? So we actually knew the size of it. It's tiny model, right? It's literally, on size, on par with sort of the open models. Now, with 2.0, they obviously made the model a bit bigger, right? Because they no longer tell us the size and it's not in an academic paper, etc. Now, one of the things I find fascinating about that is that 4.1 nano has got to be sort of a heads up signal of what OpenAI is going to release open source. So we've heard, Sam Altman talk about this and stuff like that, and that they're going to go for an open source model. My guess is it's something going to be on par with that nano model. Uh, the 4.1 mini looking like an awesome model, basically, as good, if not better than the 4.0 model, which actually costs a lot more and stuff like that. And then the new 4.1, I the yeah, 4.1, whatever it is. Yes. That one seems to have had a massive bump. And then on top of all of that, the sort of fourth model that they talked about today was not a addition, but a subtraction, was that they're deprecating the 4.5 model, right, from the API. So the API costs for that were ridiculously expensive. It clearly took up a lot of compute. And I think I said to you earlier on that I feel vindicated, on my YouTube video of like just saying that like no one's going to use this thing. Well, it seems like maybe I was right, that like OpenAI have decided that it's better to deploy those GPUs for other models. So I think model wise, that's really interesting. Last week we saw OpenAI talk about new memory features. We've seen a whole bunch of sort of agentic stuff from them. This is, going back to these models support that agentic ecosystem. I think that's
Right.
crucial.
Yeah, this idea of an ecosystem. So let's go into that second point. The AI ecosystem is down to a few players. I would say two leading players, and maybe three, right? Which is OpenAI linked with Microsoft, right? That ecosystem's very rich. Obviously, first mover, Microsoft's really nice Azure cloud, the redundancy that they have, the performance across the world, and then Google very much matching that, right, with leading models internally and its own cloud. And then you have like maybe this third player, which is Anthropic linked with AWS. That link is not as strong, right? Because Google's a big investor in Anthropic, but it's a potentially third player. And so, Sam, if we're talking about how the ecosystem is the most important, especially for enterprise players, right? The enterprise players are winning because of this horse race on the model side. But let's move to this ecosystem. How would you say Google and Microsoft slash OpenAI rank, right? Are they on parity, or is there some differentiation happening?
I think, okay, feature-wise, they're pretty much on parity, right? It's looking like that. We know, for example, Microsoft's had an agentic framework, AutoGen, for a long time. They seem to be doubling down on that. Google just introduced their agentic framework. In many ways, last week was Google catching up for a lot of things. I But at the same time, sort of playing their sort of ace card was the new TPUs that they talked about. Now, this didn't get heaps of coverage, press wise. Mostly, I think, in some ways it's kind of boring, right? It's just that they got way better at inference. And we know that, like, entire companies like Grok with a Q are built around being inference providers. And they've made this massive pitch that, oh, not everyone's going to want to pay the Nvidia tax and stuff like that. And clearly,
So you're referring to the tax that Google's use. What do you mean by?
okay, so what I mean by the Nvidia tax is that Google's got their own hardware, right? They pay for the manufacture of that hardware, they pay for the research of that hardware. Per unit, that's probably, 10, 15% of what the
Right.
equivalent from Nvidia would cost if you're going to go out and buy that, right? So, just like people talk about the Apple tax for RAM and things like that, right? The same now is for Nvidia, is that if you're going for Nvidia, you're going to be paying a certain level per compute, for a certain amount of compute. Now, Google's getting that at a massive discount because they're making it themselves. And I think this is their huge advantage over, both Microsoft and especially OpenAI, right? Um, I think Microsoft, well, it has sort of experimented with making their own hardware. They're trying things out. They, seem to be doing stuff with quantum things, all this sort of stuff. But OpenAI is sitting there at the mercy of Nvidia at the moment, right? If Jensen decides tomorrow that he doesn't like, OpenAI or Sam Altman, he can make their life extremely difficult. And you got to think that a large part of Sam Altman's job at the moment is trying to work out how they can make their own hardware and make their own GPUs.
Right. So I would totally agree. So TPUs from Google is probably, you called it the ace card. I would really agree with that. When you talk with the executives from Google, and we did, we had multiple conversations last week. They kept coming back when you bring the two. Okay, what really is the long-term differentiator? They say, hey, a large part of it is the TPU they've been working on for 8 years that no one's noticed year after year, right? Or iteration after iteration. It's improved many times. And so now this is finally culminated into a massive advantage in terms of efficiency. And so, um,
Not only has it improved many times, it seems to be improving at a faster rate than the Nvidia chips are improving. So, the distance between the TPUs and the Nvidias seems to be getting, a lot more.
right. And if Nvidia is claiming a 50% margin, right, which it needs to do to justify the 3 trillion market cap, then that's a bigger percentage for enterprise companies that are going to be running on inference. And so that's one area where Google has an advantage. Let's talk about the other aspect, the key aspects of the ecosystem. There's probably 100, 200 different variables of these cloud AI agentic ecosystems. We're not going to touch on all of them, but one area that right. So if we're saying, roughly, in terms of cloud offering, right, Azure is very good. Google is very good. But when you get into, say, transparency, the idea of detailed model cards and safety reports as it's linked to kind of the ecosystem, is that a significant differentiator where OpenAI doesn't seem as transparent, or is that?
I don't see that as a huge differentiator personally. I kind of feel like, okay, all the models are made in roughly the same way, right? That's
Yeah, and then we're going back into the model point. But okay, so let's come back on it. Okay, so we talked about TPUs. Um, what about the model guard, the extensive model guard that Google's offering? It's a little more. It feels like it's a little more open. It's A to A protocol, right? This agent to agent protocol that many of our viewers, listeners may not have heard of, but it was announced last week. Seemed this is the protocol that essentially embraces the leading one, which is the model context protocol from Anthropic, that everyone seems to have adopted over the last couple of months, but then takes it further, right? So that agents can not only negotiate or and call on tools, but other agents. And they made it open and connecting lots of different players. And then their agent SDK is also embracing and open. You can pull in an open AI model. So it feels like Google's a little more open and extensible. Would you say that's a major plus?
Look, to be fair to OpenAI, their agent framework also lets you use other models. So, that's a key thing. I think where Google, with the A to A thing, Google's making a play to have the agent store, right? And you notice that when we asked Richard in the interview, he kind of smiled and
Schroeder, who's the lead evangelist for Google Cloud.
yes, and he sort of nodded and yeah, went along and talked about it and stuff like that. Now that wasn't talked about publicly last week, right? That was kind of interesting that the keynote didn't talk about this agent to agent thing being the sort of precursor to an agent app store or something like that. But you got to think that's the way that it's going. You were talking about the model garden that Google has. They also introduced last week an agent garden, right? With the whole these sort of generic agents. And I kind of, from my take on it, from sort of walking around the floor, seeing what startups were doing and stuff like that, I kind of feel like, okay, you're going to have a certain number of types of agents that are very generic, right? That everyone's going to be using roughly the same kind of implementation, stuff like that. That's at one end. And at the other end, you're going to have extremely customized agents. And I don't think there's going to be a huge amount in the middle, or I think it's going to fall into one of these two categories. And walking around looking at startups, I saw crap loads of really boring generic agents, right? And very little on the really highly customized stuff. And I kind of feel that the open AIs of the world, the Googles, the ecosystems that we're talking about, they're going to dominate this generic agent stuff, right? They for them basically agents is coming down to intelligence plus compute, right? So if you've got the compute, if you've got the intelligence, you can run all of that at scale, deploy it. You've got a cloud story, you've got all that. As you pointed out, OpenAI, better hang on to that partnership with Microsoft because Azure allows them to have that whole sort of story. I think, one of my biggest takeaways from last week was that startups are kind of not doing that well, right? Like looking at the sort of smaller players.
And you talk about startups that are offering the
Yeah, that's
ecosystems,
right.
right? So not
I
yeah.
there were lots of, companies offering agentic systems there last week, and, I made the joke on Twitter that, forget counting the word AI, count the word a agents, and it sort of held true, right? My takeaway though,
In terms of the keynote.
yeah, in terms of the keynote, but even walking around the floor, no one talks about AI now. They talk about agents. And it seems to me you've got like the players, like you've got sort of people like Salesforce, right? Who are making maybe, they're working out what their customers need. They're making agents for that. But they're also really making agents to stop their current customers leaving, right? So this is in many ways as much a defensive play as it is an offensive play. The startups are purely playing offensive and they're not playing it well, right? They're just making the boring sort of, at least from everything I saw in demos, it was the sort of standard, stuff. Like I was sort of begging to, okay, show me a startup that's just doing like, banking agents, and you've got 26 type of banking agents that do everything to put half of the employees in a bank out of business. Nothing like that there, right? And that's what we should be seeing if we're going to see like startups break through and stuff like that.
It's actually a little worrying yeah, we had so much competition, so much flourishing of these startups that were offering these different also on the model side, right? So whether it's DeepSeek or Cohere, you have a bunch of others that were a little smaller, Mistral. You begin to right if we're moving to an ecosystem play versus a model play, then you're actually then going to see question marks around the future of those smaller players or those model first players, right? Would you agree?
I think like okay, don't forget, when people talk about the Chinese companies, one of the biggest one is Quen, which is actually Alibaba Cloud, right? So they've got the ecosystem play that they can make, quite well. You've got to think that the funny thing is like if anything, DeepSeek has kind of made the models on the side while they're a super successful hedge fund, right? So maybe their play is like, no, 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 our ecosystem is to make money, trading with this stuff. And that would then fall into the really highly customized kind of agents that I was talking about that they're doing. That does seem like, a really interesting kind of thing there. We've got, some other players in China that do have like an ecosystem around them, Tencent and stuff like that. Maybe less known to people in the US, but they're really big players that have lots of consumer companies, lots of things like that.
Okay, Sam. So then, if we're talking about an enterprise company, right, the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies that are looking to build AI solutions, let's say, um, they're looking for models. They're looking for a cloud solution. Let's summarize the significance of OpenAI's announcement today, right? In light of the Google announcements last week, and what it means for this ecosystem more, right? So, what has OpenAI actually done today to change, to move the needle?
Really now the way I look at agents is intelligence plus compute. So today, basically, OpenAI has increased the intelligence for less money, right? And that's the pattern that we're seeing again and again and again. And every time that becomes a step forward, we get better agents, we get better, quality of these things. I really think. I suspect that at OpenAI, they kind of realized that, so we're hearing lots of rumors about them having these $2,000 agents right up to $20,000 agents per month kind of thing. And my guess is that they are starting to experiment with the really highly customized ones, right? Where they kind of know, and, uh, and everyone wants to be diplomatic. Nobody wants to say that these things are going to put people out of jobs. But if they're going to be any good, they're going to put people out of jobs, right? It's that simple. That sure enough, you've got the I'll hold your hand and help you get it done kind of agents. But what everyone sort of wants is the agents that are actually going to just go out and do it,
Right.
right? And say, right, it's done. Here, you look at this. We've seen that starting to come, with coding. Google also released, a whole sort of their own sort of vibe coding kind of tool, again, built around the really good things. I
Right.
will not be surprised if we see something like that from
Which
OpenAI,
what was the tool you're referring to?
the Firebase Studio.
Oh, the Firebase Studio. That's right.
Which is pretty amazing. I gave that to on Friday. I basically told one of my team, just spend the day mucking around with this, see what you can build. And sure enough, they built like a whole website
Yeah.
with backend, with everything.
Yeah.
And I asked them, like, how does this compare? And they said, oh, it's like, on par with Cursor, if not better,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So coming back to this OpenAI announcement today and where it stands with Google, I would say they are not going to win on quality or in performance. OpenAI has the lead for distribution now. It needs to maintain that. And in any previous era where you have one player against the other, where it's the iPhone versus the Android, whether it's this, you know, Windows operating system versus the other. It's always the leader that is has got options. The second player has to exceed in some other way. So OpenAI just needs parity. It's ahead on distribution, so it just needs to hang in there, and that's what this announcement is. It's hanging in there, at least for me, right? Because it feels like it still needs to be the best option on quality, and it's saying, hey, you can still come to us for the best option on quality, but it's not going to be winning on quality or performance against Google, right? So it needs to move to things like experience, to memory. That's why it's announcing, hey, you've got this extended memory now. It had the image stuff for consumers, but
Okay, I wouldn't jump to that conclusion too quickly. I agree with everything you said, by
yeah,
the way, right? About them just having to do that. But we know, for example, this 4.1 is not one of the reasoning models. We know that they're sitting on O3 and O4 mini reasoning models, which are supposedly going to be much better. We know that they're sitting on GPT-5, which they're talking about combining this sort of state-of-the-art LLM with the reasoning model to make something even better.
But doesn't that underscore my point, right? Which is that at every one of these, OpenAI is trying to match Google's strategy. Google has the same thing. It has the Gemma open source, right? It has the large and the small. It
Okay, I think the Gemma open source is quite different, right?
Okay. But my point is they're trying to match each other on each point, and I think OpenAI is doing that. And so I think that's my point, Sam, is that they can't win on differentiation in terms of quality, performance, size, speed, coding ability.
Let's see, right? Let's see how good the GPT-5 model is going to be, right? If that model comes out and, Altman's always said that, oh, that's going to be like at least a 10% bump, over or sorry, 10% or 10x or something like that.
Right.
He said it's going to be a huge bump compared to, the previous model, that you will notice it, right? Okay, if that is true, right? We've got what, about a month now to Google's I/O. So the big question is, are we going to see Gemini 3
Yeah.
talked about there?
Yeah.
Like maybe not released, but sort of like previewed or something like that. You've got to think that around that time, maybe the month after GPT-5 drops, and these other, reasoning models drop, I, you know, everyone is going to get better, right? Everyone's going to. You're totally right in what you're saying, that like today's release just sort of gets them enough to keep up and keep justifying, people staying on their
But it's a
platform.
defensive strategy, right? They've got the customers, so let's just keep them and just be able to say, "Hey, we're good enough," right? You don't have to worry about changing because we're not standing still. And I'm not suggesting that they're going to give up the enterprise play and go after consumer just because they have that leadership. In fact, that API only strategy for 4.1 shows this, right? It's that it's not as releasing this for the consumer version, right? It's definitely wanting to play serious.
It is definitely kind of interesting why they're sticking to the 4.5 for the consumer, which is expensive.
Right.
And, I guess like they're paying for it. And this one is just like a API. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting play.
Yeah. Aren't they gonna deprecate the 4.5 though, and then just go back to
They've said they're gonna deprecate 4.5 on the API. They haven't said they're gonna deprecate it in ChatGPT. That one I'm not sure.
okay, yeah, but I don't like 4.5 on ChatGPT.
So like yeah, like a little bit. You got to think. So that model, from everything I've been told about that model, that was originally supposed to be GPT-5, right? It was trained in the first half of last year or something about a year ago. It just hasn't lived up to the newer models, and I don't think that's a criticism of that model. I think it's just that as people have got, both Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, as everyone's gotten better at training on synthetic data, at doing all these kinds of things, the advancements, right? People talk about just scaling up and getting better, right? But actually, the algorithmic advancements and synthetic data advancements and stuff like that are actually making these things better as well. So they're purely just scaling up, and clearly GPT-5, based on the fact that what they're charging for the API is a huge, must be some sort of huge model for them to serve,
Yeah.
right? That's not an efficient way compared to say their O3, mini models and stuff like that, and now this 4.1.
Okay. Bottom line,
But
right? Bottom line is that enterprises are winning left and right? You got better models, better TPUs, bringing down the cost and increasing efficiency, right? Better reliability, better agent to agent protocols, allowing you to have connections to all the other customers, your databases, other assets that you have around the company. It just goes on and on. So this is a really good time for enterprises to lean in and experiment with some of the stuff and deploy actually.
Totally, totally, yeah. Like there's no inhibiting factors of cost like there were, a year ago, year and a half, 2 years ago, kind of thing. Definitely, people should be, experimenting with both providers, perhaps, including Anthropic, all three providers,
Right.
going on here. The costs are not huge. And enterprise is also going to win by I think it was made clear last week that enterprise is also going to win by the fact that the Googles and the Microsofts are going to make all those generic agents for you. So if you do want a meeting notes taker that's just for your company and a little bit optimized, you'll just be able to take something off the shelf and just change it a little
And
bit.
that's why Salesforce is freaking out because you can actually make a CRM for yourself, right? Without paying the $13,000 or whatever it is per seat.
Well, that's totally true, right? You've got to think that a lot of companies now are going to go, well, hang on a minute, something like Salesforce, yeah, it's been really good for us, but if we could just customize it all this way and we could, make our own and replicate it.
Just have a code, just have the code agent replicate this thing, baby.
Yeah, no, like that's certainly on the way, right? That does seem to be on the way. So you've got to think the whole SaaS business model changes a lot with this new agentic model and ecosystem model that we're talking about.
All right. Well, so much more to go into over this week, next week. So thank you, Sam, for joining us.
Awesome.